You're listening to Conversation Balloons, interviews with experts and friends about how the generations can help each other thrive. I'm your host, Leah Farish. Check out this episode. Dr. Michael Gurian is our guest today, and he's a social philosopher and author of over 30 books, several of which have made the New York Times bestseller list. He works as a marriage and family counselor in private practice and consults for institutions, and we're delighted that he's willing to come and speak with us today. Welcome, Dr. Gurian.
Well, thank you, Leah. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I heard you a few years ago and have never forgotten your insights and the freshness, the compassion, the nuance with which you deal with the subject of gender differences, certainly a fraught subject these days.
Right.
It appears that your insights and approach are made possible by new developments in science that we just didn't have available 20, 30 years ago, like in genetics, environmental science, brain science, in utero development, all of those things. You're basing your findings on really newer data that is very needed and isn't sufficiently recognized. So I just think your work is so important.
Oh, thank you. That means so much. Thank you, Leah.
Well, tell us some of the things that have been made possible, especially in brain science, that have informed your scholarship that people didn't know about when we weren't able to scan brains and measure hormones and watch the development of the fetus.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe a core part of it is exactly that, the development, how the development works and how male and female are set up, and they are set up in utero, and they're set up because of XXXY. And so in the 80s, we started. In the 80s was when like a few brain scans started to be available, where you could see male-female brain difference. But as you say, it's really been more recent over the last number of decades where brain scans, where so many scientists are doing scans, and like when I deliver talks, training, and so on, I show these scans, and people can see, oh wow, yeah, look how differently the male and the female brain operate, and how they're formatted differently, they're set up differently, and that part hasn't really changed, even though the social conversation, or maybe the social media kind of conversation, is now, well, there is no male and female, that kind of thing. But that's not true. There is male and female, and in fact, male and female are really our only two possibilities. They're in all our cells. You're female in your cells or you're male in your cells. But at the same time, so there is this thing called gender. And I think what has confused people is they're thinking, well, if gender fluidity exists, or if this Thing called gender exists, then it must be male and female don't exist, right? But we're forgetting that the science is based on the science of sex. And sex obviously is male sex, female sex. And even a person who's gender fluid is still male or female, because sex is quote unquote binary, whereas gender is fluid, and they're not the same thing. And I think that I think that's really confusing to people. But the science hasn't really changed. Like, we've known since the 80s, 90s, now we've known that all over the world, males and females are set up differently, and that it happens because of genetics affecting the child in utero. You know what I mean? But the and that confusion is also new. Like, we used to talk about androgyny, 20, 30 years ago, and I think it's a really neat topic. But we weren't saying because we can be androgynous that we're not male or we're not female. The difference now is people are trying to say, well, if you're gender fluid, you are not male, you are not female, whereas gender is an add-on, it's not the base.
And tell us, of course, we have the disadvantage of not having images in this podcast, but uh, can you describe some of the differences in the male brain from the female brain?
Yeah, some really kind of huge differences. And we want to remind people, remember that this is research from all over the world. So it's what we call transcultural. This neuroscience is transcultural, transracial. In other words, the race and the sex don't matter for this. They can matter for a number of things, but they wouldn't matter for this. So I'll give you three. One is the male brain is mainly doing language on the left, whereas females, women, girls are doing language on both sides, and that means that they have more connectivity. So girls and women have more connectivity to where language is at the top of the brain, and then into the midbrain, which is where feelings are, senses, the sensory register, memories, and so that's one big set of differences under one difference. Another one is white matter activity. Female brain, girls and women are using up to 10 times more white matter activity. Boys are using more gray matter activity. So white matter is all through the brain, whereas gray matter is in splotches. So males do things in splotches in their brain. Females are doing the same thing, but they're spreading it out throughout their brain. And that actually sets up some profound male-female differences. And then a third one I'll give is the cerebellum. And this is really important for education or anything having to do with really learning anything. Males are cerebellum dependent. So we really need that part at the base of our brain, the cerebellum. We need that to be active quite often in order for us to learn. And it's one of the reasons that the sort of sit down in chairs, I'm going to lecture to you. It's one of the reasons that works so much less well with boys than it does with girls. Girls don't need that cerebellum involvement. It's good for them, but they don't need it. They can sit and they have the hormonology for that, and they listen, and most of their brain activity is up in the frontal lobe with white matter activity. But with boys, they often need movement. The cerebellum is a movement part of the brain. It's the doing part. They really need that if they're going to get the frontal lobe and the other parts of their brain active. So that's just a few. There's, we've tracked, my group, we've tracked about 100 profound differences like that between male and female brain.
Wow. And tell us some more about how these differences show up in the classroom and in both in classroom behavior and performance.
Yeah, well, these differences get added to, the hormone differences. So males have up 10 to 20 times more testosterone moving through their systems than females. So females have more oxytocin, which is a bonding chemical. Males may have more of this aggression chemical, this more movement chemical. So you put that together, and in a classroom, unfortunately, just like you were saying, over the last, say, 30 years, we have constructed classrooms, I'd say it probably goes back a little further. We've constructed classrooms that are a far better fit for girls and women for what we would call the female brain, because of the sitting, the listening, and then non-movement, and so boys don't learn as well. Like, for instance, 70% of the D's and F's in the U.S. are boys. Right? That's like too big. That gap is way too big. So it's very clear something is going on in our school systems. And it's not the teachers. The teachers are wonderful people. It's not really that. It's that we have not trained them in this. And in fact, politically, we've avoided it. So we've avoided training teachers in it. And the reason the Gurian Institute exists is that we go school to school and train teachers. Because once they're trained in it, then they get it and they go, oh, yeah, our classroom is much better set up for female. We got to get the boys moving around. And the other thing is the aggression. We, like the schools we go into and where we train, there might be 50 discipline referrals to the vice principal before we come in. But then after those discipline referrals, which are almost all boys, 95% boys, those discipline referrals go down to 10. Oh, right? Wow. Which is massive change, because now the teachers understand male behavior. They understand why boys are moving around, why they're fidgeting, how they're doing that, how they're relating to each other, and they make fun of each other or say something that actually the other person doesn't doesn't care about and actually likes it, but the teacher doesn't like it, right? And the boy gets punished. But when they are, when the teachers understand it and the counselors, everyone understand male behavior and how males are set up, then, oh, wait a minute, that's okay. Those boys are nurturing each other. They're not actually attacking each other. And so the discipline referrals also change. So it's both behavior and in terms of academic learning.
I noticed I was a classroom teacher for 4 years and was the head of an English department in a high school, and then have taught in college classrooms off and on for 20 years. And I've noticed that boys occupy kind of the two ends of a curve, and the girls are in the big middle. And so boys would maybe be the D and F students, like you said. They make 70% of the D's and F's. But also, I was teaching usually English or language-heavy classes like pre-law. Or they were the spectacular, creative, A-plus debaters and poets. It was kind of an interesting spread there. But the girls were kind of, in the middle and very compliant, always more dependable and more understandable to me as a woman.
Right.
I also have been interested in the linguistic behavior of males versus females, and have learned that girls attribute things in conversation much more diligently than boys. They say, she said this, and she kind of seemed like she meant this, and they do a lot of meta-analysis all around whatever dialogue they're reporting, whereas boys just report the gist of it, what the action point was. And yet, it's usually men who are mimics, boys who are mimics, boys who are, or men who are impressionists and who capture all the fine points of how someone else expresses themselves. Again, I found a difference in that respect. And girls usually remember, I think it's been documented, they remember the wording of how someone expresses themselves more accurately than boys do. I also found as a lawyer that men express themselves metaphorically much more than women do. And so they'd say, well, we got to boil this down to the final peg here, and we got to play this out to the ninth inning, and we got to, and usually women don't express themselves that way. It's interesting. Men would often use sports metaphors when we were in kind of an adversarial setting, and women almost never do that. They're very kind of purist.
Yeah, I mean, it's really neat what you're talking about. The first thing about the curve, right, about the high end and the low end. So it depends on what one is looking at. Now males are, if we go back 50 years, 40 years, and we were to take, we'd have to figure out what it is we're looking at. But if we were to take grades, at that time, the guys had the highest grades and the lowest grades. Now, and over the last, say, 25 years, now girls have the highest grades, boys have the lowest grades. So it shifted in the school setting because males are struggling so much in school. But the genius male concept has not changed. And so in other words, you have more male Einsteins, right, than you do female. And so that's a separate topic, right? That's the genius male. And we believe that the reason, we used to believe, obviously, as young feminists and as feminist thinkers, we used to believe the reason there are more male geniuses is because of socialization, right? That women, there was gender bias against women in school, etc. But we know that is not true in in the aggregate. Somewhere there is definitely gender bias against women, right? But in the aggregate, females are getting a better education, et cetera, but there are still more male geniuses. And so what we really think is happening there is gray matter activity. So females spread out what they do, they spread it throughout the brain. And genius usually is a hyper-developed gray matter part of the brain, like Einstein's inferior parietal lobule, which is this place where physics and astronomy is done. And it was massive in his brain. But a lot of other parts of his brain weren't, not so much. And so we kind of think that's, I want to add that to what you were saying about the curve. We kind of think that's what's going on with that. Because now males, like I was saying, males don't get the best grades, et cetera. But they're still those geniuses, those Steve Jobs, right? And those, et cetera. And then, and also wonderful what you were saying about the way everyone uses words. It is just so true. So the female brain has so much more white matter activity and so many more verbal centers, and then a larger hippocampus, which is the memory center, so it's larger, and then more connections between the word centers and the hippocampus. So when women are detailing something that happened even 30 years ago, they're getting all the detail, right? And guys don't remember it, or they remember something vaguely. And you're so right about how guys will try to tell stories that will involve metaphors, and often sports are good metaphors for them because guys are, testosterone, higher testosterone, like sports. So maybe they grab from that because they shorten it all because they don't remember it as well, and they're not connecting as much emotional information to it because they don't even remember the emotions at that time. But the woman or girl or daughter, other lawyer that they're talking to can remember that and can put it into words. And so that's a profound word difference, and then word to feeling, word to memory difference. And it, I think, is the primary reason for that pattern you see. And you're seeing a pattern of difference that, again, it's multicultural. It's all over the world, this male-female difference. So whenever people are listening to words, I always say, even if it's your kids or someone, listen to the way people use words. Be a citizen scientist and listen to it for like 30 days, do real science on it, observe for 30 days. And I believe people are going to find the difference that you laid out. And there's always a 1 in 5 exception rate. So they're always going to find there's going to be a female genius, of course, to my earlier point. And there's going to be a guy who is really good with detailing his emotions. So absolutely, exceptions will always exist. But in general, I believe people will see the pattern you've described.
Yeah, I was fascinated by, I can't remember which book because I've read so many by you and they're all wonderful, and your interviews, your lectures are so wonderful. But one place you said that boys, maybe as a function of their testosterone level, which is higher, would, if they don't trust a person, they tend to be more aggressive toward that person. And as a classroom teacher, I remember one time I just did this one time, but I surveyed a class and asked yes or no to this question: do you trust your teacher to teach you the things that you need to know? And a couple of the boys said no, and they were the most aggressive kids in my class. And I thought, wow, there's a connection here between trusting me and being aggressive toward me. And that's not something that that's not how she would handle a lack of trust. But I noticed you said you recommended, and you did, go for walks with your male counselees, especially boys that you want to develop trust with. You have learned that gets them to trust you and gets their barriers down. And I thought that was brilliant. I remember I was a student teacher and I took a boy with me on a walk, and we even walked off campus, which was totally against the rules, but we just walked, and we started talking, and he'd been a D student. He was in terrible shape. And we just had a real breakthrough in communication, just by walking side by side. And I thought that was so good that you've incorporated that into a counseling practice. How did you figure out to do that?
Yeah, it was sort of good science. It was sort of serendipity. I was doing research, early in my practice. I've been a mental health counselor since '90, so for 34 years, and I was writing my first trade book then, The Prince and the King, and I was doing this brain research. And my early practice, I was just like everyone else, come into my office, sit for 50 minutes, let's talk. But then I was doing this. Well, one thing I was finding is that, males don't stay in counseling the way females do, right? I mean, obviously some do, but we're talking in the aggregate statistically. Right. And so it's like, what is that about? And then I'm doing this brain research and looking at these brain scans so that's what's going on. And so somewhere around 93 or 94, I started putting it all together and changed my counseling practice. And because of this neuroscience, because of understanding just what you've described, the effect of testosterone and also the fact that for males to trust, they got to have the bond. And it's not as natural for them to be able to talk about what they feel. I mean, that's no bias or anything. That's just the way the brain is set up, right? Mm-hmm. More gray matter activity, less white matter activity, all these things. More frontal lobe activity in the female brain, less in the male brain. So males are not going to connect as well. And then testosterone is an aggression chemical, as you said, and we call it the fight or flight chemical. And females are dominated by oxytocin, which is the tend and befriend chemical. So when males get under stress, that adds more testosterone. They get higher testosterone and more fight or flight. And when females are under stress, they can be aggressive. Of course they can, but they also will get more oxytocin, which is that bonding chemical, that pleasing. I want to please you. I'm going to sit and talk to you. I want to tell you what I feel. Well, these are separate chemical bases and different chemical bases that interact with different brains. So if I'm going to really get through to males, and this is true of any parent, any person, if we're going to get through to males, and they're going to get at that emotional information we want, right? We got to know they've got less of it in their brains than we, especially we women and counselors, would like them to have at any given moment, right? So we're going to have to really go deep mining for it. And in order to deeply mine for it, we have to form a trust relationship with them in which they know that we understand them, right? That's where the trust comes from. So when I'm walking around with them, they know, okay, I'm trying to understand them and I can understand them. But when I'm sitting across from them for 50 minutes in a chair and saying, look me in the eye and tell me what you feel, what they think is, oh, I can't trust this guy. This is not a safe place. I'll give it a shot. I'll remember a few things. I'll talk as much as I can. And then 3 visits later, I'm done with counseling. Mm-hmm. And what I'm going to tell my spouse or my mom who brought me in, if I'm a boy, is this, this person doesn't understand me. I don't need this. I don't care about this. But what's really happening is that the counselor, and this expands to parents or anyone, teachers, etc., is not meeting the boy where the boy is and where his brain is, and instead is probably complaining. This is like a big complaint in our culture right now. Those guys won't tell us what they feel. They're toxic or whatever it is because they won't tell us what they feel. And we're just not understanding, hey, they're set up differently. If we want them to trust us, if we want to be safe for them, we can't just say to them, I'm safe for you. Tell me what you feel. Mm-hmm. We really have to prove it to them by understanding them.
I was so touched when you said in one place, we never said our girls are defective. We always said the system is defective. And we have recognized the needs of girls to do things a certain way so that they can succeed and to recognize their gifting. And I like your argument that we have failed to do that equally for boys. As I've visited mosques several times, I've spent a lot of time in Muslim countries, and I've noticed that the men are expected in in their services to stand shoulder to shoulder. So even if the mosque isn't full, those men are touching each other. They're shoulder to shoulder. And I think that's very powerful for men to have that shoulder to shoulder experience in worship. The women are not required to do that. They can sit anywhere around the periphery or behind the screen or whatever the arrangement is, and they don't have that need. But it's a very reinforcing, empowering thing, I think, for men.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's so true. And you've said two different things, really wonderful things I want to pull out. The first is about the difference between how we look at males and females culturally, and the brain science. So I have two daughters, and as you know, I've written a lot of books on raising girls and a lot on girls in schools. So I'm not a either or person. When we apply the brain science and all the culture science and everything to girls and women, we've looked at that science. Like I've looked at that science and said, "Wow, look at this female brain. It's so wonderful." In some ways, especially in certain workplaces, this is underutilized. We need to, have more empowerment for females to utilize this wonderful brain. And you're right. We didn't tend to say, oh, well, she's defective. Now, 100 or 200 years ago, we did. Of course. Yeah.
True.
And that's what we're not into that, obviously, anymore. But in the last 50 years, we haven't looked at girls and women as defective, right? Just the opposite. We've said, hey, we need more of that. And that is the irony and the sadness, I think. And it's a bad cultural legacy that we're struggling with right now as males are violent and withdrawn and, doing some really bad things to us. Because we as a culture did just the opposite. You are absolutely right. Anything having to do with boys or men, it's okay. That's defective. They're defective.
That's toxic masculinity.
It's toxic masculinity. And we've been having this for like probably 30, 40 years of everything that gets listed is that they're defective. And so what we're ending up with is like in a school setting, girls are the way we want people to learn. The way boys learn is defective. Or in relationships, all relationships need to be the way that anecdotally this female wants it to be, let's say. And it's anecdotal because not all women are going to say the same thing. And if the guy isn't doing that, he's defective, and across the board. And that's really a dangerous thing. And it shows we don't understand males, and we're going to reap some real pain from that. And I believe we're starting to see in the last 10 years that because we don't understand males, we're just not raising them in the way they need to be raised to have purpose and et cetera. And so they're withdrawing or they're killing. So that I really wanted to, kind of reiterate what you said. I think you're absolutely right. And probably our biggest cultural need right now, I think, our biggest cultural need is to reframe the way we understand males. And once we reframe it, to start raising them again, not to erase these 5 defects we see in them, but to understand the way they do it and look at how they do things as an asset. And we have this with aggression nurturance. So I work with the concept of aggression nurturance and empathy nurturance. And the female brain is better set up, especially because of a part of the brain called the insula. This part of the brain fills up with mirror neurons in females to a much greater extent than males. So when she sees something, her brain fills up with mirror neurons. And then all this stuff you were talking about with words and connecting, all this great stuff happens. And she has direct empathy. Not in every case, obviously, but I think people know what I mean. Whereas when guys see that same thing, unless the person they see who's in pain is like really, dying, like really gone, they'll tend to say something like, "Oh, you're good. Get up. You're good. Come on, let's get back to work."
Yeah, we need you. I remember you said,
"Yeah, we need you. We need you.
Yeah,
we need you. So get back up." And this is true, of course, in sports constantly. Well, that's called aggression nurturance. So people will say, "But wait a minute, that's not empathic. Look, this boy fell down. He's hurt." But the guy would say, "Hey, I'm being just as nurturing as the person who who was immediately empathic and came and said, "Are you okay?" Which, by the way, is a really good thing to do. Empathy nurturance is great, but so is aggression nurturance because it builds resilience. And this boy who fell down, now, again, he's not dead. He just fell down. This boy who fell down, when we say, "Get up, we need you, get back in the game," what we're saying to him is, you have a purpose, and we need you in that purpose. And that purpose right now is to aggressively pursue this goal. If it's a game, it's a, soccer or whatever the game is. And that's aggression nurturance. It's just as nurturing as empathy nurturance, but we don't understand it. And this, in school systems, this happens in neighborhoods, on playgrounds, where guys are they're doing aggression nurturance, but we shut it down and we say it's defective because it's not empathy nurturance in our definition. And of course, it's unconscious in us. We just are looking at that and going, that's bad. And we have to reframe and understand that these things that males do, this male brain, it's actually an asset. So let's use the asset. And of course, we'll meet in the middle. Males and females meet in the middle and et cetera. But it's an asset. It's not a liability.
I just toured a center for the homeless the other day, and I was aware that there's a lot of empathy nurturance going on there, but I just wanted to look some of these beautiful young men in the eye and say, "Get up, we need you." And that really can't be done appropriately, but I don't know their story. But I feel like it's great to provide them everything they need. It's great to be compassionate in the sense of, providing them food and letting them have shelter. But I trying to find out from these people, are you giving them purpose? What are you telling them about themselves? And of course, addiction is in the picture, and yet they are. These men are needed. We have, I'd love for you to share some of the statistics on where these men are, especially our young men. They're living in basements with their parents. They're not joining the military. They're not going to work. They're not in degree programs. We've got 75% of all seminaries are women now. The bachelor's degrees, what is it? 70% of those graduates are women.
60%.
Yeah. So is it because the men lack purpose?
Well, yes, I hear what you're saying. Now with homeless, folks often don't know that about somewhere just under 80% of the homeless are actually male. And that in itself should give us pause. Like, we should go, okay, that's another one of those things, like 70% of D's and F's are male, where as you are so smartly, you're asking these questions and going, okay, why is that? What is happening there? And the permanent unemployed, right? We have around 10 million permanent unemployed who are male and not caregiving, right? So there are women who are permanently unemployed, but they're not. They're caregiving their children. So different statistic. So yeah, we've got these big issues, and they are. I think it's fine to say they're without purpose, what you just said, and then to like subcategorize, because they're also online. I mean, a lot of where guys are now, right, since they're not doing things. You gave the living in the basement. They're living in the basement, but they're doing something, and they're doing all of it through screens, right? And that is not really relationship, right? The screen is handy. You and I are able to communicate via this handy, of course, but it's not relationship. Even interactive video games, which often young guys will tell me, well, I'm in a relationship through interactive video games. And I'll go, okay, it's something, but it's still not a relationship. When you are actually with somebody in the same room and you are talking to them and relating with them and walking with them, or even watching TV with them, you're still present with them. There are pheromones that both bodies put out there is a whole brain function that goes on because you're in an in-person relationship.
And you get in a feedback loop, I bet.
Yeah, and so they're not in those relationships. That's part of where they're not. And then they're in the screen. So they're doing porn, they're doing social media, they're doing all sorts of stuff via screen, and we're losing a lot of them to that. And that's part of the purposelessness. And it kind of goes back to our culture not understanding male development, so we don't develop them as boys into men. And we first started talking about sex and gender and these things. One of the positives of understanding what gender is that we can expand our concept of what a human being is, and that's always good. But the negative of throwing out sex, of saying, well, there really is no male, there really is no female, or if it is, it's very small, is that we have thrown out male development. And by throwing out male development, we are not, from the first few years of life, already giving them purpose, right? And guiding them all through elementary school, middle school, high school, et cetera, to have a purpose. Develop your islands of competence. What are the 2 or 3 things you're great at? We're going to help you develop those. You're going to find purpose through that. How do you do relationships? Okay, we're going to help you with transmitting values through relationships. And, so purpose is not just about a work. It's not just about being a truck driver, let's say, later in life. It's not just about being a college professor, right? I mean, it's partly about work, but it's partly about rites of passage and advancing boys into healthy manhood. And the male brain is set up so that if you don't do that, if a culture doesn't do that, we're going to have tens of millions of males who are not grown up. They don't mature, and it's because we did not mature them, and so they will recede, fight or flight. They will withdraw, and they'll withdraw into closed rooms, not just basements, but little apartments, in which they just interact or faux interact via screens. And, by then they're 35, 40. I mean, it's going to be very hard to save these guys. So I'm hoping we can do it earlier. And we have in the U.S. right now, we have around 10 million unfilled jobs. So there's certainly a place these males can go work-wise if we can just help them have the purpose and get there.
You talk about male fragility, and tell us about that.
Yeah, there are, let's take just life expectancy, okay, right? Everyone knows that in some countries, males die 10 to 12 years earlier. In the U.S., it's between 5 and 6 years earlier. And then as you go back through, let's say you start with death and you go back through disease and, et cetera, and you go back all the way, what you find is that males are actually very fragile. And the reason they're fragile is the Y chromosome. So estrogen, so women are XX, right? Men are XY. You have 2 X's. So both mom and dad, right, gave X's to the female. Doesn't mean she's not going to suffer. It doesn't mean life can't be hard for her. It doesn't mean she's not fragile. That's not what we're saying. But when we compare those 2 X's with the X and the Y, what we find is that throughout the lifespan, these males are more fragile. They're going to get more of these diseases. They're going to die earlier of these diseases. And they themselves, partly because of testosterone, which comes off the Y, they're going to go do more high-risk things. So, for instance, 95% of workplace deaths are male. Well, they're going to pick the jobs like climbing to the top of skyscrapers because they don't have as much frontal lobe involvement as the young women do. And the frontal lobe is executive decision-making. It says, oh, no, I'm not going to climb 95 stories high.
That looks dangerous.
That is dangerous. I am not going to do that. So she doesn't, but the guy does. The testosterone is there, and that even becomes some of his purpose. And it's thrilling, and he wants to build something and all that. Well, he's more likely to die, right? Because, or to get severely hurt. So when we look at the Y chromosome, and then, we see how it manifests through the lifespan, we see the fragility. We see the fragility in education. Boys are more fragile in education. We see the fragility in the way that they learn, etc. And then we go all the way back into the gene itself, and there are more ragged edges on that gene.
Wow.
than on the X. And so it's even a more fragile gene. And part of it we think is because of estrogen. We think that estrogen is an amazing protectant. And so over the million years of human development, as the X and the Y are developing, the theory is, why is the X less fragile? Well, we think it's because of the estrogen. But it may not be that. Whatever it is, males are much more fragile than we think.
And you also talk about the effects of childhood insecure attachment. You said the effects of insecure attachment are harsher on boys, and teen girls show less effect from abuse, less effect of abuse on their cognition. Girls do show emotional and relational damage, but they seem to be more resilient into their teen and adult years after some, poor parenting, shall we say?
Okay, I see what you're getting at. So if we take some examples of how both boys and girls can experience trauma, and then we track these cohorts, right, through life, what we find is that trauma obviously is bad for any human being. We would rather we didn't have the abuse, et cetera. It's bad for any human being. And everyone's gonna have to compartmentalize that trauma, male, female, everybody. And as we track the cohorts, what we can see are some differences. For instance, girls who have been equally traumatized, we're taking equal trauma, let's say both this male and female were abused. As they go through life, they have more assets, like frontal lobe assets and frontal lobe activity. And so they don't tend to do as badly in school, right, as maybe the brother who is traumatized would do. Doesn't mean they weren't terribly hurt, but because of the frontal lobe access, right, and because they don't have as much fragility there as guys do, because we don't use as much frontal lobe. And then father attachment's another example. So we can track cohorts of kids who were raised without father, and around 1/3 of American children are raised without dads for significant periods of their lives. Now, sometimes the dad is a bad person, and we don't want our child raised by that dad. Okay, so all that's factored in. But generally, dads are quite good enough, and we really do want the kids to have that attachment, but they don't get that. So then we track boys and girls, and what we find is that girls definitely suffer. They're more likely to be abused later. They're more likely to be addicted, etc. And though, in comparison to boys, it's even more so for the boys. So the boys are even more likely, right, to get involved in dangerous behavior, to become violent, etc. So we can track cohorts, and we can see how fragile these guys are. And it doesn't obviously minimize the fact that women are fragile too, but what it shows is that we maybe don't understand guys. We don't understand how this brain is set up. And so when we raise them without dads, we're not understanding that, and or male role models, we're not understanding that can be very destructive to their development. I think if we understood that fragility, and we understood the role that we all play in helping males to be resilient and to have purpose, like I think, for instance, we would do divorce court differently. I think we would do custody differently. We would go, oh, wait a minute. We can see direct effects of lack of father on these guys. And I'll just pick boys for a moment. Okay, we're going to have to train judges in this so that when judges are setting up custody, they got to know we don't want that. We want the father involved, right? So there's specific things we can gain by tracking this fragility, and there will often be policy and law, and like in schools, altering, the training of teachers, with counselors, altering the way we train counselors to deal with males. In every one of our environments, this male fragility applies, and we can train people to kind of offset it to help the guys. And it does no harm to girls. The great thing here is the more we learn about boys and help boys, by the way, the more we'll help girls, because female lives will be better, because male lives are better.
Happy boys, happy girls.
Yeah.
I was struck and saddened by how you've experienced obstacles in overcoming this dominant gender paradigm that you talk about, and the what I call a zero sum thinking of, if we help boys, we're hurting girls, and that's so unfortunate. How can we address that? Are you having any success? You talk a lot in Saving Our Sons about this dominant gender paradigm
Yeah.
that assumes that we can't address any of these problems you've talked about without it being at the expense of girls' success.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's like when you and I were coming up, right? I mean, I'm not going to say what your age is. I'm 65. We're coming up. I'm assuming you're a baby boomer around that, and I'm
Yeah.
a baby boomer, and so we're coming up. I'm coming up as a young feminist. I'm, totally committed to the concepts of early feminism, not understanding that there's really two feminisms that are being developed, right? There's
Mm.
one that we now call equity feminism, which is what I was involved in, which is we need equality for women and men, for boys and girls. But there was another one that now I think it's Christina Hoff Sommers named it, gender feminism, which is what you're talking about here. And it has control of academe. And because it has control of academe, that means it has control of the media and government, because they just jump off of what is trending in academe. And what's trended in academe is this gender feminism, which is a single concept. Females are victims, right? Girls and women are victims. Boys and men are either victors, winners, or they're villains, right? They victimize the girls and women. So that's the paradigm, and everything is going to go under that paradigm. And that is not the kind of feminism that I'm involved in, and it doesn't lead to equity. It does lead to, in specific places, it leads to some empowerment of some women, which is obviously a good thing. But overall, it doesn't do as good a job as equity feminism, which says, hey, both males and females have issues. We need to have equity. We need to make sure that these two subsets, males and females, are equal. That means we have to empower girls and women. We have to empower boys and men. Well, gender feminism just sees that as anathema. They just think, oh, well, you're so stupid because boys and men are just villains, and and they're the ones who are defective, and girls and women are victims, and everything has to be about taking care of these victims. So what I do, obviously, is I use the science. So the way that I've skirted around this, let's say, I mean, as you can tell, I'm willing to confront it, but it's not really the subject of my teacher training in a school, right? They don't need that. And so what I'm doing in the teacher training, and to your point about success, if people go to GurianInstitute.com, that's the website, GurianInstitute.com, and if you click the button success, what people will see is all these schools that have used our program and have gotten the training and then have created equity. And it uplifts both males and females. So what happens is the test scores for girls and boys both go up. So that includes girls. Their test scores go up. The grades for both boys and girls go up, right? Because this is our Boys and Girls Learn Differently program. It's not only boys, not only girls, it's both. And the discipline referrals for both boys and girls go down, right? So behavior improves. The bullying goes down in both boys and girls. And so what I believe we ought to do is we ought to really have kind of a scientific feminism, which is based in the science and says, okay, let's really look at these brains, these bodies, these wonderful souls, and let's, from the science, pull out what we need to help everybody. And so that's how I do my work, and how the people I'm involved with, we do our work. But we're aware that the dominant gender paradigm, which is that gender feminist paradigm, is in control of academia. And so it's in control of government, and it's in control of media. And
it's in control of funding.
And that means it's control of funding. So, for instance, there are There's still no national commission on boys and men, whereas there is a $100 million funded commission on girls and women. And again, like you said, it's not zero sum. Let's keep that $100 million there to help girls and women, but we got to have one on boys and men. And it's the same for the states. The states have commissions on girls and women. They don't have commissions on boys and men. Mm-hmm. And once, I'll end this part with that quote that's in Saving Our Sons. I was asking a high government official in the Department of Justice about this. Why are there no commissions for boys and men, right? And we've got these 7 commissions on girls and women. And why is all these billions of dollars are being spent to help girls and women, and we're not spending it on boys and men? And he said, well, we are in the prison system. And he knew the irony of what he was saying. He understood the dilemma. And that shows how messed up our culture is if we don't spend money on developing boys and men until they go to prison, right? There's something wrong with that.
Dr. Gurian, this has been so stimulating and thought-provoking, challenging, and I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for your scholarship and your courage in this area, and we wish you well on your journey to help both boys and girls. We want to encourage everyone to rate us and review us, subscribe on whatever platform you get your podcasts. Thanks to Caleb, our producer, and hear from us next time. Thanks for listening to Conversation Balloons. Look for more episodes and information at leahfarish.com. That's LEAHFARISH.com. And follow me on Facebook and Instagram.